and welcome everyone to our webinar on data catalogs and governance. It is an interesting one. It's a difficult problem for chief data officers and everyone kind of working in that organization, for engineers, for API consumers, and everyone involved in this kind of API marketplace. So hopefully, this will be an interesting conversation for you folks. We have a very interesting set of demos lined up towards the end. So hopefully we'll end on a high note. And with that, let me get started. My name is Sandeep. I'm one of the field CTOs at Hasura. My background is in product management, engineering, and customer success, solutions engineering at Hasura, and just kind of working with different kinds of organizations here at Hasura, helping them implement API platforms and implement API strategies. And I want to welcome Ken, someone I have the great privilege of calling a co-worker. He's most recently was a director of architecture for a very, very large bank, I think Fortune 50-ish banks, and has otherwise held C-level technology executive positions in finance, risk management, bio firms, and even a medtech firm, and even Enron. That's a nice story for some other day. But he's a rock star. He's seen it all in his long career, and he's also recently joined us as a field CTO at Hasura, and that's where my privilege of calling him a coworker comes from. So Ken, welcome to this webinar, and very excited to talk about data catalogs.
Well, thank you, Sandeep.
All right. So I'll kick things off by first getting into a quick primer on data catalogs, right? So Ken, could you give us a brief background on what data catalogs are, how are they used, and maybe even misused in enterprises?
Sure. I might even add abused to that list.
Yes. I'm sure there's enough of that going around.
And many of the people on the call may already know these things, but so just want to quickly level set. So if people aren't aware, we can kind of all get everyone to the same sort of level of understanding. From my perspective, the data catalog is one of the key artifacts that the chief data officer owns. It's probably pretty obvious to people that it's a data discovery mechanism. Its entire role is to help users quickly find data and generally provide some sort of searchability capability for you to identify data assets within an organization. Beyond that, typically there's additional metadata around the context of the data, maybe the quality of the data, and the lineage of the data, all of it to help people understand the purpose of that data and its fit for use in a particular circumstance. From a chief data officer's perspective, this entire artifact is there to enhance trust in data. Right? So if there is no trust in data, you've got a big problem in your organization. And this is the key artifact that tells that narrative, that explains why you should trust data. The other couple other maybe historical facts about data catalogs. I mean, going back maybe 15, 16 years, you probably didn't hear much about them, maybe a little bit. But there are a variety of regulations that have really required more understanding of data and more liability if you don't understand data. The most important one that probably kind of created the modern era of data catalogs was the 2010 regs for financial services that were a reaction to the 2007/2008 financial crisis. But also GDPR is added to that quite a bit as well. And of course, prior to that, HIPAA regulations in medical industry also required chief data officers to exist. They often didn't exist previously, required them to exist, and it required them to produce various artifacts so that people could effectively be able to determine that the data was trustworthy. So having said that, frequently the chief data officer has data stewards that may be aligned directly to her in a matrix. Those data stewards are the ones who are doing more of the heavy lifting and getting this information into the data catalog. And then it's probably a little unfortunate, but one of the main audiences is auditors, but also business analysts. They often will look at these things. It's, in my experience, it's less typical for engineers to use data catalogs because frequently the metadata isn't quite maybe either accurate enough or detailed enough for them for it to be particularly useful. But I think we should aspire for engineers to be able to use data catalogs. So that's just a few bits. I mean, there's 1,000 other things I could say about data catalogs, but that's just a kind of to get you started.
Yeah, awesome. I think the key bit for me was a trustworthy source of exactly what's going on in your data landscape, and I think that's a great way to kind of summarize that, right? All right, so this makes sense. The abstract idea of a data catalog and who the stakeholders are and what they intend to do with this catalog. But in the wild, what kind of features and use cases does a typical data catalog support?
Sure. So we can dig down a little bit further.
Mhm.
I would say that, and you could think of a lot of different ways, but I would maybe break it into two big buckets. Things that are very governance focused. And then with the advent and sort of traction that data mesh has gotten, people are starting to think about the concept of a data marketplace. And data catalogs kind of also have some of those features as well, at least some of the more forward-thinking data catalog vendors that are out there. So from a governance perspective, you have to classify data, right? You have to understand what is your confidential data, restricted data, what is public data, and then confidentiality has some subcategories like personally identifiable information. This is one of the key things. You must understand the data that is particularly exiting your organization and be able to classify it correctly so that you're not exposing confidential information to entities that shouldn't see it. The other piece is lineage. Lineage is very effective, or should be, the way you define that your data is accurate. Well, it's a part of it anyway. But in best case, you want to go from system of origin all the way to the egress, right, of your data domains. And then finally, you have to establish ownership of each piece of data. So if there's ever an issue, you have one throat to choke, perhaps, right? The other thing that you might find in a governance-oriented sort of feature set would be data quality and the results of data quality testing. In my experience, these are typically done kind of at the, what I would call like the single entity level, right? So, invoices, user, complaints, loans, right? They're going to have data quality testing associated with each of those things. I do think it's kind of interesting that while we may pick up a lot of information as we test at that level, I think the big missing piece is when at the very last mile, all of those entities get composited for exec reporting, reports that go to the board, reg reports. And I think when they get composited together for other use cases is actually where we pick up a lot of risk. You often don't see that in data catalogs, but it's sort of a little bug I got in my I hear that we really need to start looking at data quality at the composition level as well. And so then the other piece is this data marketplace bit, right? And so that's, can I sample it? Can I find data anomalies? Can I profile the data? Right? Maybe can I run an AI chat and get insight into the data? Right? And the most important, can I acquire the data? Right? How
Right.
can I request access to that data and get it? And to me, that's the marketplace piece.
Understood. And I can see why you call that the more forward-facing feature set, right? Because looks like there's some um, read-only behavior to more interactive behavior happening here. So that makes sense. And an interesting idea about the data quality piece. I feel like the crux of it is the more code we write, the more black boxes we create for people to understand what kind of logic is embedded there. So that's always interesting. Um, this what you just described can sounds like a wide array of functionality that a data catalog, a good data catalog, in fact, must support. So, do large enterprises kind of build? Do they buy? How do they put this together? And how do they also go about populating this? Like it seems like buying is maybe the first step if you choose to buy, but there's a lot to do after that as well. So, what does that journey look like for enterprises?
Sure. So let's talk about build buy for a second.
Mhm.
These are clearly commodities. You don't want to reinvent it. Buying is
Right.
generally the place you go. I think that if you don't buy and you go to from a build perspective, it's usually a cost issue. A lot of data catalogs can be quite expensive. And I think in mid-market, sometimes people will mash together some of their technical metadata and some of those systems and kind of do a DIY catalog. So you might see that in those kinds of environments. But typically in large enterprises, they're purchasing a data catalog of some sort. And then in terms of populating it, the ideal is, and this is what the catalog vendors would tell you, is that you should be scanning your physical data assets, acquiring that metadata, and building the technical metadata in that catalog. And then generally humans come in and add things like glossaries, taxonomies, and stuff on top of that. However, I think it often becomes very, very challenging to actually automatically scan these things. And what I've seen more often in large enterprises is that they establish a standard, right, that says you must contribute this information to our data catalog in this format. And then the data domains, the data stewards, the people, product owners, it's their responsibility to upload this information into the data catalog on a periodic basis. And then that's often where it goes really wrong. Because if, to me, in terms of a data standard, particularly from a data catalog standard, setting aside everything else, the most important thing is to have a really good approach to data addressability. When you describe a piece of data, you must have an objective way to find it, locate it, probably automatically, right? And what I've often seen is that these data standards don't understand all of the kinds of potential data sources, right? Graph stores, NoSQL, relational data, big data, unstructured data. And they frequently have kind of a substandard approach to developing data addressability. And this is where this manual integration kind of starts to break down.
Got it. Got it. And all right, again, very complex stuff to deal with. If I were an enterprise, I'd probably go purchase one. Are there commonly used data catalogs out there? What are the ones that you've seen in the wild? And
Sure. There's like 5 or 6 that come up the most. Apache Atlas is great. Some banks do use it. In fact, JP Morgan uses Apache Atlas, and it's free. So it's open source. It's very governance focused, I would say, on Apache Atlas. It does not have much of those marketplace features, and that's a little bit of the disappointment around it. But free is it's hard to argue with. So Apache Atlas is pretty good. Atlan Atlan is actually Apache Atlas that's been customized heavily. And one of the great things is if you start with Apache Atlas and then you want more of those marketplace features, you can pretty quickly upgrade to Atlan as a commercial approach. Calibra is very popular, but they're completely, proprietary in the way, it's not an open source product, of course. Calibra is used by Bank of America along with many other organizations. Lation's also very popular. I don't know a lot about it other than it's very popular. And then Stardog is a really interesting take on data catalogs. They've got a lot of graph analysis built into it, which I think gets more into that marketplace feature as well. So those are just a few of it. But if I was purchasing one, again, it goes back to some of the issues I just mentioned. You really want to make sure that you can represent complex objects in these data catalogs because everyone's focused on polyglot data storage. You got S3 buckets, you got big data, I got NoSQL, I got graph stores, right? You have to be able to put all of that stuff into your data catalog. And so those are the things I'd be focusing on when I look at those products. And you can see they're all on a different spectrum of being able to support those complex data objects. Apache Atlas actually has a type system underneath it, and I'll show you later, but you can just basically create a type that can represent any complex object and customize Apache Atlas in that way. Some of the others may do some of those things, I'm not aware of it, but those are the things I'd be focused on. And if anything looks like it's just 2D models, relational, right, that's like a red flag. That's just not going to support you long term. Those are the things I'd be looking for. And again, these sorts of marketplace features, the ability to run AI across it, get insight across the data, et cetera, are all great value adds that may be in some of those products and the things I'd be focusing on when I looked at them.
Got it. Got it. All right. That's a great summary. Thanks, Ken. I think what a data catalog is, who are the stakeholders, what kind of use cases are they looking to implement using one, how they go about it, what are typical challenges with that, and what are tools that help you kind of implement this is a very good kind of primer on that. And with that primer, we will move to the next section, right? Which is data catalogs and API platforms, right? In practice, exactly what is going on? Because on the cover story looks good. I think data catalogs are great. They help implement excellent use cases, required and necessary use cases. But exactly how effective have they turned out to be? I think since 2010,
Sure.
let's say.
Sure. Well, I like to say they're as effective as your chief data officer is effective, right?
Okay. All right. Okay. And
careful planning, strategy, good organizational strategy where you've got clear separation of responsibilities. If you don't have the basics, your data catalog's not going to really work out. The other thing that I think often doesn't work is the final API layer. And I think the data access layer has to be in your data catalog, or you're going to really struggle to explain end-to-end how your data is being used. I think it's a lot less typical that people do that. And I think the reason that they don't do it is if you're just consuming open API REST endpoints into it, they're too opaque. They don't easily explain how they connect back into the data. And then it turns out to not be very useful to you. So I think data access layers, getting them into the data catalog is an important step in making them effective and really being able to tell an end-to-end story about why I can trust this data. The other thing that I'd say, well, let me just stop there, Cindy. So what else can I tell you?
I think first thing is we've established there's a fall guy, right? Like if the data catalog's not working, there's a CDO to blame. All right. But
Well,
let's
someone's
say,
going to be the fall guy. It turns out the CDO usually will have someone set up to take the blame. But anyway,
but can if you were the CDO, right? Like, how would you kind of go about building and executing this strategy? What's a good way to think about
well, aside
implementing
from defining my fall guy in advance, just to
this?
work out, I think the number one advice I'd give is, and if you do not integrate your data catalog into your routines and metrics, it's never going to work, right? And I think the number one routine you need to integrate it with is your data access requests. If when people need data, if they have to go to that data catalog to ask for access to that data, you're golden. You've driven all traffic is going to that data catalog, and you're going to have huge adoption. The other big reason for that is data catalogs are only really good if you got a lot of eyeballs on it. A lot of people need to be looking at it so that you build a feedback loop. And so again, if you integrate it into your routines, you're kind of forcing people to interact with it. But as you force people to interact with it, they're going to give you feedback. And now your data is going to improve, right? I can't tell you how many organizations I've been in where the data catalog is just this asset that sits off to the side. A handful of people use it, and it's principally used for regulators to make sure that we can demonstrate that we've got control of our data. But that's not a good recipe for building a flywheel of data improvement.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And I think for those of you paying attention, this is some solid strategy gold here. I think what Ken's saying is, if your data catalog is the place where you can sample and interact with the data, it kind of is your access layer as well. So the same substrate that gives you a catalog is also your access layer. That is phenomenal, because now you don't have code or any other transformation getting in the way of explaining what is happening. Again, kind of going back to what Ken said earlier from about being able to explain everything from the system of origin to the point of egress from your organization, right?
I think
And
you extend a little bit beyond what I was trying to articulate in that particular comment, but I agree with you. I think ignoring whether or not you've got a metadata-driven access layer that's driving a data catalog, which all sounds like great practice, even if you don't have any of that, if people have to go to that data catalog to ask for data, you're creating this feedback loop, period, right? Now,
right.
there are ways you could make it even better, and I've got ideas on that, which you're starting to allude to, of course.
All right. All right. I'm sure we'll get to them in a bit. So Ken, I think the strategy sounds, I think I'm fairly convinced with the strategy, all positive things that flywheel to implement in the organization. Um, why then is it so difficult? Why is it hard to implement a good data catalog strategy in an organization?
It all starts with giving up on, to some extent, giving up on automation, right? The minute, first of all, in large organizations, it's a vast amount of data. I mean, it's overwhelming how much data there is, right? And it's overwhelming how many human beings are interacting with that data. And if you're going to kind of have some manual integration where people have to create data feeds that go into these data catalogs, et cetera, and you have human beings reviewing it, et cetera, just the human error is just going to get you. Quality is going to be low. It has to be highly automated. And I know it's hard, and that's why people give up on it, right? But you have to stick to it and make sure it's highly, highly automated. Anything other than that, it's just gonna slowly, speaking of a flywheel, the flywheel is gonna reverse on you. You're gonna have a negative reinforcing loop if you've got too much manual integration. The other issue is that data addressability strategy. If you cannot explain in concrete terms the location of a piece of data. Again, big red flag.
Got it. Got it. Got it.
I guess, well, let's just leave it at that. What else can I
All
tell you?
right. Uh, all right. So how do we solve these? Right? Like these are challenges that you've identified. There's no automation, lots of data. How does one go about solving them? I think you kind of alluded to this in your first opening statement, but
Well, so we've been dancing around a little bit here in this conversation. Of course, this is all sponsored by Hasura, so perhaps there's a Hasura solution in here somewhere, which we'll eventually get to. But I do think it goes back to this concept. If you've got a concept and can understand how to articulate data addressability, you're halfway there to building a metadata-driven access layer. And if you can create an active metadata strategy around this sort of data addressability as the core, then you can really start making this hum for you real well. So let me explain what I mean by active metadata, because I think some people have different perspectives, right? Active metadata is the way, if you can express how a system should operate in metadata, and then you have systems that consume that metadata and then operate as articulated in that metadata, you have created active metadata. And then further, if you have detailed logging coming out of those systems using those same metadata terms, you now have a single feedback loop, all based on a common articulation of metadata, right? Now you can do a lot. You can just do so many things once you've cracked the code on that one, right? You can derive things from that active metadata for different personas, like you could derive a data catalog for the data steward and the business analysts and the auditors, right? You can build developer experiences to help them understand how to use composite data, etc. Right? To me, this is the gold standard on how you build an effective data catalog, but actually, really, it's about how you build an effective data organization, particularly the technology to support that data organization.
understood. This is a lot of info. I kind of understand the abstract idea, but what would this translate into for an organization? Let's say I kind of go down this path that you advocated. Um,
Right. So it sounds really complicated, and it sounds like, how would I get this huge organization to adopt all of this stuff, right?
mm,
So first of all, I did it once. Uh, so this concept. And I think the very first thing you want to understand is that I would focus on a metadata-driven access layer, and I would be less focused on trying to get like tie it all up from system of origin all the way up to the egress point, right? I would start with formalizing and getting better technology on the egress side with the metadata-driven access layer, and I'll tell you why. It's because once you have that in place, first of all, that'll give you one-hop lineage back to your first data source. But the second thing that's going to do is it's going to tell you who's using your data. And particularly, and this may be hard for some people to comprehend, but if you have self-service composition in that metadata-driven access layer, you're going to start to allow your data domain users to start to get rid of a lot of the complex layers within their organization. So now you see who's using it. Less kind of busy work is going back to the domain, so they're able to actually start focusing on what they really need to do. And so I would put this in right up front, put in a metadata-driven access layer, think of that as a control layer. It's going to give you who's using it, and it's going to provide additional self-service features to your consumers that will offload work from your data domains. And all of that's going to, like over a 5, 6, 7 year period, it's just going to naturally, maybe you might have to nudge it a bit, but somewhere between naturally and a little nudge, you're going to start to decomplexify and de-risk your data environment. And of course, as I was saying, that's also how you end up being able to do a data catalog. So now your data catalog, it's just a reflection of that metadata-driven access layer. So everything's the same. There can be no drift, right? I've expressed how my data should operate. My platforms operate that way, and every user experience I build off of that is just telling the exact same story. Everything's the same, right?
I think this, for those of you who have joined us for previous webinars in this series, Ken has a very interesting way to kind of express this. Like you should do what you say. Your data should do what it says, and it should say what it does. Right? Just that integrity, that consistency.
You forgot the prove it part. Do what you say, or say what you do what you say, and prove it. It sounds a little flippant, but personally, that's etched in my brain, and everything I'm doing from a data perspective, I'm always trying to do those 3 things.
I think that's a kernel of this data strategy that you're espousing, right? Like, yeah, should be. Makes sense. Ken, before we get to the demos, there's a very interesting comment from Lewis here. I'll read it out. I'd love a reaction from you. We are at 35 minutes into the webinar. We have plenty of time for the demo, so maybe a couple of minutes on this would be interesting. So Lewis says, Ken is correct about the gap between data catalog and data access. In our organization, the reason for Colibra is compliance, not access. The chief data officer does not govern the source of data or the use cases, the access patterns. To compound the flywheel issue, they're usually motivated only by monolith central solutions like data lake houses and not federation.
There's this huge focus on building lake houses, and I love all that technology, but people overthink it a little bit. I think you're getting ahead of yourself. If you haven't controlled your access layer, you don't know what to build, right? So these are all wonderful technologies, but I don't think they're at the enterprise level. They're at the data domain level. So what I say is data domains, pick the technology that you want to use, right? If you want to build a data lakehouse, great. But that's a data domain. The data mesh sits across that. And for the most part, the data mesh is operationalized by your data access API strategy, right? And without that control layer at the top, it just always devolves. It never really works out. So again, metadata-driven access layer, fairly important. That gets you 50% of the way there. Then start adding key self-service features into it, particularly composition, aggregation, and selection, because those 3 features are often trying to be handled by the data domains, right? Who are trying to deliver against these narrow use cases that are coming to them from the consumers. What you want them to do is to focus on reusable data products, let the consumers build, their sort of narrow use cases using selection, composition, and aggregation from your access layer. But whoever said that,
Lewis.
Who was the person who made that comment?
Lewis Meadows. Yeah.
Lewis, you and I we're together on that. This is exactly what I've seen everywhere else. And without that flywheel, those 3 things I said are the flywheel, right? It just always just doesn't work. It's crazy that people don't perceive it, though, to be honest. I just always amazed by it. So what else can I tell you, Sandeep?
I think that's pretty much it. Lewis, thank you for that anecdote. Would love to maybe invite you for a follow-up conversation, maybe in a webinar if you'd love to talk about these things. But in any case, would love to chat. Um, and with that, Ken, I think it's time for drum roll your demos.
So let's look at, these are all things that I built that were pretty easy to build. And they were easy to build because I was using the Hasura DDN supergraph technology. Now, people could build their own metadata-driven access layers. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I'm just really talking about it from a strategy perspective. But I built all this with a product. I built it using the Hasura DDN product. So I was able to take, for example, this is Atlas, and I'm going to use their newer interface, which I can get to from here. And so I integrated a supergraph. Now I use the Chinook database. People are familiar with that. It's like a music store idea. It's kind of maybe a little too simplified, but let me show you how this works. So in Apache Atlas, you have to define the things that your data that operate your data environment, right? So if it's a relational database, you'd have something like database. You might have something like a data flow, maybe to represent like a NiFi or Airflow process or something. In a supergraph, I just created all the types that represent the things in a supergraph, right? So a supergraph is at the top of this hierarchy, and I've got one called Enterprise. You can see it has 2 domains associated with it. And this is sort of all the technical metadata in supergraph terms imported into Apache Atlas. Now, this is a bidirectional feed, and I'll get into why that's important later. But if I'm like, say, a data steward or business analyst, this is probably not my starting point. I don't start with technical metadata because that's not my job, right? If I'm a data steward, I might be thinking more about classification. So I can come in here and I can find everything that's PII or confidential, or I can find out everything that's restricted. In this case, I have none. And I just entered these things. Actually, I had ChatGPT do all the classifications for me, but humans probably should do it, or at least in association with artificial intelligence, they do that. So I'm the data steward. I'm really focused on classification, and I can see everything that's classified here. And then, of course, I can go in, I can find what it's related to. I can find things like lineage, et cetera. I'll do a little better example of that in a moment. The other thing I can do is I can add additional classifications, right? If I want to say, oh, this is restricted, I, as a data steward, can do that. This will then sync back into our metadata layer as well. And our developers will actually be able to see these classifications, and everyone's sort of working off the same information when they're looking at data. The other thing you can do, which would be quite typical if you were an analyst, maybe a business analyst or a data steward, is you might want to look at this maybe from a subject perspective. So I built a glossary and a taxonomy. Again, I had AI do it for me. It really wasn't very much work. But let's look at music entities. Music entities is the top level of a taxonomy. And actually in Apache Atlas, you can have a taxonomy as many levels deep as you want. And beliefs of a taxonomy are always a term. So in this case, I have 3 terms associated with music entities. So we can look at album. We can see that albums is a technical metadata element associated with this term, right? And then you can dig further into it. Maybe as an analyst, I'm trying to figure out, where does this connect to, or who's using it, that sort of stuff. So I can come in here and I can find out, that it has a business name associated with it. And actually, I think in here, I have multiple business names. So if in different contexts you're using different business names, you can do that. I could look at, say, album ID, and I could figure out that this is a column. I could figure out how it's tested. Again, it has a business name, what its underlying data type is, descriptions, etc. I can look at the relationships of this column. Column is in supergraph terms, is your data source. So this is sort of your physical data. This flows into this, which is a field, which is part of an object, which is provisioned by these two APIs. And because supergraphs have traversal, you can composite data, it tells me that I can also traverse into tracks if I wanted to composite this into a more complex object, right? So this is pretty fascinating. If you're the data steward, you get a lot of information, and it's all on their terms, right? These are the things they're interested in, right? It's not about the technical, how all this sort of works together under the covers. So I'll just stop there, and because I'm going to go to sort of the developer persona and the experience they can get. But does anyone have any questions about that? Or Sandeep, do you have a question?
No, nothing for me. This makes sense to me. I'll just see if we have more questions in chat from our attendees. Um, no, I think we're good to.
I want to point out this is about 100 lines of Python code. It's not hard because you're starting with a well-structured metadata layer, right? And so you just translate it into the format that this tool is asking for, right? Now, if you're a developer, you might want to look at it differently, right? So developer might want to look at it like in this DDN console, right? So I can see here's my domain app. This is another domain, but I don't have any objects in it. This is my only data connector, and these are the things that this data connector can connect to supply data into this app. You can search from here, right? You get kind of more technical information about this because I'm a developer. I'm trying to figure out how to use this. And eventually I can come in here and I can create queries and I can sample it. So let's say I'm a developer and I wanted to see if this sort of employees and their connection to customers, what that might look like as a query. Fingers crossed, and there we do. We get our answer right here.
Right. This is
Um,
the active data access layer at work.
Yeah, again, it's the same metadata underlying this, all the same terminology is exactly the same. So when my data steward ends up asking a question, he's using the same terms that the developer might understand and vice versa, right? And I'll give you another really interesting. Let's say you're more of a data scientist, because this is a really cool feature in the DDN console. In DDN console, one of the key issues with AI and analyzing large data sets is, which isn't commonly understood. AI is really, generative AI has really extensive long-term memory, but its short-term memory is actually pretty tiny. You have to ask it fairly focused questions, and you can only ask it a handful of follow-up questions, or it starts to, like people like to say, it hallucinates. But basically, the context window starts falling off and you start losing detail. One of the really cool things is Pacha, which is the AI assistant that's built into Hasura, actually solves that. What it does is it keeps the context off to the side and it brings it back in when it needs it to keep the hallucinations from stopping, right? So one of the cool things I can do is say, tell me what data quality issues I might encounter in this data domain. And what it's going to do is because it has all this active metadata, it can actually write all these queries, go out to this stuff, sample data, bring that into the LLM, right? That wasn't the most interesting one. Oh, now it's going to do a little bit more. So it just says these are the things it's going to check for. And now it's going to actually write some code and come up with some real examples for us. There are different kinds of potential ways it could write the code, so it actually goes through 2 or 3 iterations and will hit on the right answer eventually.
That's a feature, not a bug, folks.
Yeah, it is a
Just it
feature.
is the retrials is a feature. Sometimes you have to tweak your code. Sometimes you have to tweak the SQL. All of which is very interesting for those of you want a deeper dive into this. We can speak separately, but the retries are a feature. Sometimes it's a little irritating because you really wanted
I
to
wish
get it
I'd
right
chosen a
immediately.
different one because I'm usually much more successful than this. Um,
I think
and let's see if we
it
get.
worked. I think 6 times a charm. But I really do like the retry feature. It's not
There it is.
great
There it
demo
is.
material, but oh, there you go.
Um, oh, maybe not. I thought it did. Here we go. It figured it out. 2 tracks are found with unusually long durations. These durations are over 60 minutes, which is unusual, right? There's no duplicates. There are 978 null values and consumer and so forth. So I mean, this is like kind of gold, right? And it took us about, and unfortunately it took us about 2 minutes. Usually it takes a little bit shorter, but this is really hard to do. And so this to me is like, I'm now sort of looking at it from a data scientist persona, right? Data scientists are often trying to craft prompts for LLMs, right? Or he may take all this and use it as a way to think about how to use traditional AI models for like anomaly detection or something. And this may help prompt him to figure out how to do that, right? And then finally, let's look at it from a support person's persona. So I gotta find it. It's in here somewhere. This one. So I just ran this query, right? And I think it might have been this one. You know, actually, let me switch this up a little bit. All of that stuff with the AI like created a whole bunch of additional information. Let me come back here. I'm going to run this query real quickly. That'll kick off a trace for me. And now I can come back to here and I'll look for that. And here's the query, I think. So this is creating the query plan. Let's see if I can get the query again. Let me do it differently. Not as successful as hoping. Let me do it from a different source just to see if I can make this work. This is it right here. It's actually propagating through 2 different systems. So for whatever reason, that one doesn't work. But let me show you this one. This would be very similar to what I was explaining. As a support person, I want to see everything in this distributed system that touched this data, right? And passed it along ultimately to the end user. So now you can look in here, you can see all the details associated with it. And you can see, you can see all the language, again, that comes straight out of that metadata. So this is the whole story, right? I now have a data scientist, I have a developer, I have a support person, I have a data steward and a business analyst, all working against the same metadata, all speaking the same language. And I'd really love to hear if anyone else has perceived this as a problem, but what I've often seen is that all of these groups develop their own ways of thinking about and talking about this, and they spend all their time translating between each other and spending a lot less time really understanding the issue and resolving it. If you've ever seen a support person just try to figure out something coming in from like a user who's saying there's an issue, right? And figuring out how the heck that maps into the system, all of that goes away because of this strong orientation towards metadata, right? That's distributed across all of the users and the systems that they're interoperating with. Sandeep, what do you think?
I think it's amazing. It's mind-blowing, in fact, that you can do all of these different things like a multifaceted metadata that can be drawn out to support different personas. And I think it kind of goes back to that kernel, that data culture piece that we were talking about, right? No translation, everybody's working off of the same source of truth metadata. And yeah, I think that I can't even begin to imagine the sheer number of dollars you would save trying to, like
Well, I've
not have to trust.
like
You calculate.
So, as you know, I've done a lot of architecture work in large organizations, and I did a really detailed study of the implications of this. And the number I came up with, now there's a lot of assumptions, right? So it's probably a few degrees of freedom in here, but I came up with this is about a 2/3 cost improvement when you start looking at it from the consumer and data producer's perspective. 2/3, and people are spending hundreds of millions of dollars doing this. It's a big number.
I can only imagine like financial institutions, healthcare, government agencies where you have this regulatory cloud kind of always hanging over you. Um, yeah, I can totally imagine. So pretty interesting number to not spend in 2025, folks. So
Yeah.
please chat to us in case you want to save these dollars. All right. Ken, thank you so much. As always, a pleasure. I mean, this being uh, a co-host on this webinar is such a great learning experience, and I hope that's the same for everyone who's still with us. I think it's a sign of a, a well done webinar that everyone who started this webinar is still here with us. So that's amazing. Folks, thank you so much. We'll be sharing a few resources and a recording of the webinar with you very soon. We have a couple of follow-ups for people who had questions, so we will be sending out some emails about those. Those of you who want to see a more customized demo or a one-on-one demo, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. You can let us know in chat right now, or you can contact us through the website. You just go to the website, you'll know how to contact us, and we can go from there. Well, all right. With that, we'll take a leave. Thank you so much for being with us here today, and we'll see you in one of our upcoming webinars. Thank you so much, folks. Have a good rest of the day.